welcome to the final panel of this phenomenal conference. The focus of our conversation is to consider global models of educational change, thinking about how we can reflect upon everything that we've seen, everything that we've heard, everything that has moved our hearts so deeply here in NG, and how we can inspire ripples of change in countries around the world, how to expand the revolution, but doing so in the context of being mindful, what Dr. Varaska described this morning as Angie play as a multi-dimensional essence. So how do we inspire change and hold on to that essence? I'm Julie Nicholson. I'm a professor at Mills College in Northern California, and I'm going to be the facilitator for today's closing discussion. I want to welcome our four speakers. Dr. Tovah Klein is from Barnard College. Kaleem Kher is from One City Schools in Madison, Wisconsin. Dr. Rona Juwala van Oudenhoven is from Durham Children's Aid Society. And Dr. Nico van Oudenhoven is from International Child Development Initiatives. The format, what we thought we would do, each will come up. They're going to give some opening framing comments and thoughts. Then we're going to have a conversation here on the stage, and time allowing, we're starting a little bit late, time allowing, we'd really love to have some interaction with all of you. So be thinking as they're talking about the ways that they're provoking you to think, some questions you have, and we'll have an opportunity for your exchange. Okay, well, please welcome Dr. Tovah Klein.
Hi, good afternoon. This is our final panel of just an incredible few days. I'm quite honored to be part of this. After hearing so many people just from so many angles, I feel like so many ideas are running around my head. So this was a big question that our group of people was given to talk on this last day about taking this incredible model that I think speaks to all of us in very deep ways elsewhere, because many of you in this room are either doing that or hoping or planning to do that in your countries. And I felt like I was stymied a bit by this idea of taking a model elsewhere. It's a very hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to think about. And I think often it impedes our ability to actually do it because it can get a little overwhelming. And the materials are beautiful, but I run a very small center that's a lab school, and I always think, well, I can't take those materials. But there are pieces of Angie that touch me, and I've heard many people from other countries say, yeah, we can bring parts of this, but how and what? And so that's what I'm going to focus on in my remarks, really is that when you think about taking Angie to other places where the cultures are different, the spaces are different, many of us from cities in Hong Kong and New York and many other places feel like our spaces are so small, and I don't want that to impede any of us from saying, but I can't do Angie. I might be able to do it in other ways, even with these limits. So I'm going to focus on what we could take with us in that challenge of exporting those pieces of Angie that are essential, because it is a different model, and it's different than models that call themselves child-centered. And what I picked out is really talking about this focus on children. And I think it comes from their concept of love. Obviously, we could talk about any of those important pieces of Angie, but I'm going to focus my remarks there on this concept of love and how I've seen it both in my study tour 2 years ago, where, like many of us, I was just awed and often left by the end of the day in tears because of the humanness and the respect for children. I mean, if I had a title for my talk, I would call it Seeing the World Through the Eyes of the Child, because I think that's what Angie does at its core when it starts. Or I could call it the having of their own ideas, and all those ideas matter. So those two go together. So when I think about the concept of love here and as a core for programs globally, it really starts with the ground up here. So often, as we know, programs are top down. It's about teachers, it's about outcomes, it's what your government or your city or your Department of Education insists you do, and it's kind of this top, and the children are down here, and I often feel like it's crashed down on them. This is truly from the ground up in a way that I've rarely, maybe if ever, experienced. And the child is the focus. So children are the focus, but I think beyond that, the individual child in this one moment is the focus. You can only do that if you don't have preconceived teacher or adult notions, because you can open your eyes in a much less biased way. And that really hands the world over to the child. And I feel like that's what I see starting in Anji. And even though I visited programs in the study tour and on this beautiful trip, I feel like I'm just starting to get to know that. I have to say the Chinese presentations helped tremendously, and then the various talks to understand that. But it really is starting with the child. And what that means is, we all know this, the adults are positioned differently. And that's natural. It's not as if you have to say, well, if it's from the ground up, why are the adults standing to the side? If it's the ground up, then the children own the world. They own that environment. And so the adults are almost, the natural thing to do would be what Ms. Chang told them to do, which could be natural, but it's not. It's not our instinct, which is to step back, hands down. But I also think that closing of the mouth, opening the ears, but that closing of the mouth is also really key. So then it becomes about what the teacher does or the adult does in response to the child. So you have to wait for the child before you know what you're going to do. And again, that comes out of this, I couldn't even come up with a word for it, so I'm going to use the word deep. I feel like it can be overused. But a deep respect for the child as a person and as their own person, because every child is so different, and you see that at Anji. And I watched yesterday, I have the pleasure of having one of my sons with me, who's 19, and we watched a little boy at one of the schools with, you know, a tire that many of them have, but one of those lighter ones, you know, that I think are more blown up. And if we were at that school for 45 minutes, he was with it for 45 minutes himself. It was not one of those examples of a child necessarily playing with others, but so focused on it himself, and often moving away when a lot of children came. He took it elsewhere. But he would go back and try in different ways, and eventually actually rolled it to my son and allowed him to roll it back up, putting his hands out to wait for it. So there was connection to people, but the respect of the teachers that sometimes children need their own space to do their own thing is equal to the respect of children learning to work together and co-construct their worlds. So that piece of knowing the individual for who they are is really, as we know, a hard piece, but is again a core here. And it also means then adults saying, the child can't be who I want them to be. It's not about my goals, it's about watching that child and figuring out who they are. It's definitely a mind shift. So then, you know, I can imagine giving this talk to a group of people who don't know Anji, and they say, oh, so the adults don't matter. But in fact, the adults matter more here in many ways than anywhere, because the adults are placed around the children, but also they're structuring the environment. And one of the beautiful things that I find about every Anji school, because they're all so different in terms of their spaces, but that environment, which doesn't look so structured maybe to, you know, an untrained or, you know, naive eye, is structured. And the slide yesterday where the speaker talked about redoing their sand area, you know, when I first looked at that sand area, I thought, okay, it's not like it looks terrible, but the realization that this sand area is too small for the numbers of children we have, but it's not deep enough either. And then remaking it with this border that defines that area. At every Anji school, the areas are defined, but they're not defined as, you know, with a fence and a gate. They're defined so that children can have the structure within the environment. And when you do that and materials are in a place and they stay in that place, at least at the beginning of the day, the child becomes the one who owns the space, and they also build trust that way. I know where the ladders are if I want them, is a great feeling for children. So that leads into the next piece of what it means to really hand over and put that ground-up approach that the child matters, and the child is everything, but the teachers matter too, which is no child can feel freed to explore. This has been said over talks. No child can feel free to explore or to trust themselves, which is also part of exploration, unless they feel safe and secure and trusting of those adults in their life. You know, I was thinking as I was listening to talks, it's not Lord of the Flies, but you can imagine somebody, I know that's an American reference, but you can imagine somebody hearing about Anji and saying, so the children are free to do whatever they want, isn't it chaos? I'm sure that's a question often, but it's not, because at the beginning of the year, I don't know how this works. I asked this question many times on my studies tour. The teachers connect to the new children, and the children build trust in them. And how do I know that? Because when a child's in need, either with help for something, or I saw a child get hurt yesterday, 2 children were using a very large board, one at one end, one at another, and at some point when it got put back up again, his finger got pinched. And although a teacher wasn't there immediately, they didn't need to be, but she saw it and she came over, and he was, you know, clearly hurt, and there was this nurturing moment. You've probably all seen something like that. The children trust that they'll be cared for. They also trust that the teachers won't interfere. So that inner sense of I'm safe, I can trust these people, and my environment is a place for me that allows them to move out. The other piece I think that goes with putting that child so at the center is a developmental context. And again, a couple of speakers mentioned this, but I almost feel like as I go through Anji schools, I don't even think about the developmental context because it's so interwoven that you don't feel like, oh, the 3s have something different than the 4s or 5s, but it's there. And I think that's a particularly important concept when you think about 2-year-olds. And some of the programs in the States are doing it with 2-year-olds. I don't know if Anji or China will also be doing that. But their developmental contexts are a little different. What 2-year-olds need, particularly emotionally, and to be grounded in that security of that initial separation, and what 4 or 5-year-old needs is a little bit different. But I feel like that's respected here at Anji. And another piece that goes with this is time. So I think on the first day, one of the first speakers said, waiting is love, or maybe just, somebody mentioned this, that here at Anji, it's thought that waiting is love. And that really sang to me because time is a really important factor for children. You know, we tend to rush them and move them through routines and move them through schedules. And here at Anji, there really is this sort of waiting, partly because if you don't have rules about what children have to do in their play, then they can go where they want, when they want, and that helps. But also it allows children to move at their own pace. And every child has a pace. You know, I saw children standing and watching and observing before they went forward. We all saw children taking their time, maybe climbing a ladder, and we saw others going in as quickly as they could, owning something right away. And again, if I think about the fall, when they're new to this, you're going to see more of that, but there's this really genuine respect for children have their own pace. And then what that also allows, the time factor also allows teachers to do is focus on the here and now. And children live in the here and now. They don't live in the tomorrow or in a week from now, or what's, you know, your educational goal for June when it's September. They live in the here and now, and so do the Anji adults. They live in the here and now, and they ask, what's the child doing right now? And then they show it to the children, right? And the children talk about what they were doing, maybe not right now, but just a few minutes ago. So that is the child's world, and I think that's very, very respectful of children. That then feeds into this idea that there's no judgment. I have been really marveling at, on both my visits here, that when I see a child doing something that I think, oh, is anyone going to stop that behavior? And I can think of 2 very clear examples. One was on my first study tour, and actually Larry Cohen and I were watching a zip line at one of the schools, and the children were, you know, clearly organizing themselves to whatever rhythm they had come up with to go on the zip line. But there was another child who repeatedly impeded it, pulled the zip line and held it over, tried to sort of hang it around something else. I mean, he was definitely getting in the way. The other children were getting frustrated, clearly. I don't know what they were saying, but you could tell they were getting frustrated. And I kept thinking, is any adult going to come stop this? And eventually a teacher came over and took his hand and walked with him and whispered something in his ear. And several of us asked later, what did she whisper? And we kept being told, oh, you know. We're like, no, we don't know. But it was obviously very kind and gentle. And then I saw it on one of the visits here where a child, some of you might have seen this, was pulling up pieces of the rubber, that's on the ground. And there was already a broken piece of spaghetti. He was throwing it, not happily, by the way, throwing it at some children, one of whom was a girl. And so she neutralized it by laughing as she climbed up the ladder, like, I'm not going to give him, any power in this. And then eventually a very, very, very little girl picked up a piece and threw it back. And he kind of looked. And again, a teacher just came over and took his hand, said something, took his hand. Next thing I knew, he was playing somewhere else. So this lack of judgment, clearly the teachers must have thought, we need to shift this. This probably isn't a good idea. I'm sure they were thinking we can talk about this at reflection time. But in that moment, there's no judgment. There's no judgment of my senses of any of the behaviors. Then there's no shame. So the children are allowed to live in their process. They're not shamed of what we would consider mistakes. I honestly don't think they consider them mistakes. Maybe they consider them frustrations. Something didn't work out how I wanted. But they're not shamed for it. They're not getting a sense of, is somebody happy for me or somebody upset with me? So no labels, which is really quite refreshing, to say the least. So this is all a matter of embracing children where they are in this place and time and thinking about who they are in this place and time. And without knowing this, I strongly suspect that idea of who are they in this place and time grows or changes with the child and is expected to, because children grow and change, and that's what they do. They keep saying, well, then who is this child? And when I heard that they sent home this incredible portfolio of a child over time, that then says, here's who your child is over time, with, I'm sure, narration with it. So it's not about where the adults think they should be. And then finally, on this concept of seeing the child and seeing them where they are for who they are includes listening. And that whole concept of opening your ears, I find so profound, particularly in those reflections, because that's where the having of ideas is really seen. The having of ideas is going on at every moment, right? Do I want a board? Do I want a ladder? Should I shift the angle of this? Do I want to play doctor? It was wonderful to see the doctor video from Ms. Chung today, because I think I'd seen many examples of it in the last few days. It's part of children's lives, right? But the having of ideas and choices, and let's think about it, that's the basis of being a person and of any kind of learning. Whether it's in first grade or second grade or calculus, you have to be able to think and make choices and make decisions and feel like your decisions are okay. So that's all going on. And then in those reflections, I just feel like it's almost in lights, because the children stand up there with such strength in their ideas when they're talking about the reflections. So I'm going to bring this to a close by saying that clearly seeing the world through a child's set of eyes and seeing the child's world is not easy. It's not easy to shift adults there. For many of us in the room, you think, why? How hard could that be? And also because the child's world is delightful. Let's face it, when you're in that world, it's delightful. But it is a major shift of thinking for teachers, for parents, for policymakers. And this whole idea of allowing people to play, as many of us did yesterday with great joy. I still want to come back and have 2 weeks to master the barrels. I feel like my persistent streak is going to take me 2 weeks. Took some people 10 minutes, but I need more. But it is a profound shift for adults. And so I think one of the many challenges of bringing Anji to other places is really working around that idea of, yes, environment and yes, materials, but really helping adults understand why the child's world, why risk, why freedom of choice is the way to raise decent human beings. And as somebody said, I think Andrea said this morning, when you think about where Reggio comes from and where Angie comes from, for any of us thinking of implementing Angie, it really is about who are those human beings that we want for our world. And many of us come from countries where we are hoping to have something different in future generations. And that goes back to that comment that somebody said on the first day, that there's some Chinese saying about you can look at a 3-year-old and know who the adult's going to be. Then we desperately need Angie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klein.